lonely rancher hired a baker he didn't want to know. He had one rule: stay away from my daughter. The little girl hadn't spoken a single word in 4 months, not since the night her mother died while she listened through the wall. But every morning, a warm roll appeared on the bottom step. And every morning, a small gift was left in return: a red leaf, a white pebble, a feather, a silent conversation between a broken child and a woman covered in bruises she couldn't explain. Then one night, a storm hit, and Lana heard crying coming from the barn. She had a choice: follow the rules and keep her job, or follow her heart and risk everything. What she did next shattered a father's walls, but it was what his little girl did months later, the first words she had spoken since her mother's death, that changed all of their lives forever. And those words were not what anyone expected. You're listening to Cowboy Dusk Channel, your home for tales of love, loss, and second chances on the wild western frontier. If the dust and the heartbreak call to you, you're in the right place. This story teaches us that kindness doesn't need permission. It only needs courage, even when courage looks like nothing more than a warm roll on a cold step. And sometimes the people we try hardest to protect are the ones who end up saving us. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and tell me in the comments. What moment gave you chills? Share it with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to start over. And subscribe to Cowboy Dusk so you're here when the next story rides in.
The September wind cut across the Montana plains with the kind of persistence that wore down mountains. Lena felt it through her threadbare coat as she stood on the porch of the Wright Ranch, her heart beat loud enough to drown out the distant lowing of cattle. Her worn carpet bag hung heavy in her grip, the handle pressing into fingers that still carried bruises she could not explain away. Behind her lay 3 states, and a man who had sworn she would never escape. Before her stood a closed door, and whatever waited on the other side. She knocked twice. The door remained shut for several long seconds, long enough for her to consider turning back, walking those 7 miles to town, finding some other way to disappear into the vast emptiness of the territory. Then it opened. Caleb Wright filled the doorway like he had been carved from the same timber as his house. Broad-shouldered and weathered, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving. His gray-blue eyes swept over her rounded body with the flat dismissal of a man who had stopped seeing people as anything other than problems to solve. "You are late." His voice carried the gravel of a man who did not waste words. "Yes, sir. I am sorry." The stagecoach from Billings broke an axle outside of, "You are 3 days late." He stepped aside, a gesture more practical than welcoming. "Kitchen is through there. I will show you once." Lena ducked her head and entered, her body instinctively making itself smaller despite the impossibility of that particular trick. She had spent 26 years learning how to shrink, how to take up less space, how to become the kind of woman people looked past and through and around. It was a survival skill she had perfected long before she understood she was surviving. The house smelled of old smoke and leather, and the particular emptiness that comes when a place stops being a home and becomes merely shelter. Clean enough on the surface, but hollow underneath, like someone had swept the floors and organized the shelves but forgotten to leave any warmth behind. The kitchen told a different story altogether. Dried beans scattered across a counter that had not been properly wiped in months. A cast-iron stove caked with grease and the burnt remains of meals that had never quite succeeded. Flour that had turned to paste in its sack from moisture that should never have reached it. A water pump that dripped rust into a basin already stained orange. Previous cook left 2 months back. Caleb said it like a fact about the weather. "I need bread. Fresh bread twice a week, biscuits daily. Whatever else you can manage with what is in the pantry and what the supply wagon brings monthly, you will sleep in the room off the kitchen. Wages are room, board, and $12 a month." Lena nodded, though her heart sank at the number. She had hoped for 15, maybe 20 in a desperate fantasy, but 12 meant 6 months before she could afford passage further west. 6 months of staying in one place, being visible, being findable, assuming nothing went wrong, assuming she stayed invisible enough, unremarkable enough, forgettable enough, assuming Evan Rohr did not find her first. Ranch hands eat at dawn and dusk. Caleb continued, moving through the kitchen without looking at the mess, as if he had trained himself not to see it. Noon meal is cold cuts and whatever is left from breakfast. They do not complain. They do not linger. And they do not bother the help. I have made that clear. The way he said help settled something in Lena's chest. A familiar weight, comfortable in its awfulness. She was not a person here. She was a function, a solution to a problem. She could work with that. She had built her whole life around being useful enough to keep and invisible enough to ignore. Yes, sir. One more thing. Caleb stopped at the kitchen doorway, his back still turned to her. When he spoke, his voice changed. Something underneath the gravel shifted, and for the first time Lena heard not authority, but something rawer, something that sounded almost like fear. I have a daughter, 4 years old. You will not interact with her. She does not come in the kitchen. You do not go looking for her. I want that understood. Lena blinked. Sir, I understood. The word came out harder than stone, sharper than the wind outside. It was not a question. It was a wall. Lena swallowed against the questions piling up in her throat like kindling waiting for a spark. What kind of father hid his child from the hired help? What was he protecting her from? Or what was he protecting himself from? Understood, she said quietly. He left without another word, his boots heavy on the floorboards, his presence somehow larger in absence than it had been standing right in front of her. Lena set her carpet bag down carefully, as if the floor might give way beneath even that small weight. Then she surveyed her new kingdom with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to make something from nothing, who had learned that broken things could still have purpose, if you were willing to get your hands dirty enough. She rolled up her sleeves and began. The scrubbing took hours. Lena worked through the afternoon and into the evening, her knuckles going raw against the cast iron, her back aching from bending over the basin. She cleaned the stove until the metal showed through the grease. She sorted the pantry, separating what was salvageable from what the mice had claimed. She sifted weevils from the flour and found the salt pork in the cellar that would do for seasoning. The potatoes had sprouted eyes but were firm enough underneath. As she worked, a memory rose unbidden. Her grandmother's kitchen back in Ohio. Back when learning anything seemed possible, before her parents died, before her uncle's house, before Evan. Bread is the most honest thing in this world, child. Her grandmother's voice came to her across the years, warm and flour-dusted and certain. You cannot bully it or charm it or lie to it. It only answers to patience and respect. Lena had carried those words like a second Bible across 3 states. They were the only inheritance no one had managed to steal from her. When the kitchen was finally clean enough to work in, Lena found her room, small and plain with a narrow bed and a washstand and a door that. She stopped, stared at the door, at the bolt on the inside. A lock that worked from her side, that kept the world out instead of keeping her in. She stood with her hand on that bolt for a long moment, feeling the mechanism click beneath her fingers. Such a simple thing, such a small and ordinary miracle. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Lena locked a door and felt safe behind it. She did not sleep. Instead, she mixed dough by lamplight, her hands remembering what her mind sometimes tried to forget, the particular feel of flour between her fingers, the exact amount of water needed, the way the dough changed beneath her palms from sticky chaos to something smooth and alive and full of potential. The first loaves came out of the oven at 4 in the morning, when the sky was still more promise than proof. Their crusts sang that particular crackling note that meant perfect. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and ancient, the scent of civilization itself. She heard the ranch hands before she saw them, Boots on the porch, low voices trading observations about weather and fence lines, and a steer that had gone lame in the north pasture. They filed in like soldiers at mess, 12 men ranging from a boy who could not have been more than 16 to a grizzled old-timer who looked like he had been part of the landscape since before Montana was a territory. They stopped when they smelled the bread. Lord have mercy, the old one breathed. His name was Dutch, though Lena would not learn that until later. He stood in the kitchen doorway with an expression that looked almost religious. Lena sliced thick pieces and set them out with butter she had found in the cold room, along with scrambled eggs and the last of the bacon. The men ate in a silence that felt reverent, and when they left, more than one tipped his hat to her, a gesture so unexpected that Lena felt her throat tighten with something she could not name. Caleb came in last, after the hands had cleared out. He poured himself coffee from the pot Lena had kept hot, added nothing to it, and drank it black while studying the remaining bread on the board. "This is good," he said finally. "Thank you, sir. Just Caleb. Sir makes me feel like my father." He cut himself a piece, ate it standing up without ceremony. "You know your way around a kitchen. My grandmother taught me." He nodded, asked nothing further, and left with his coffee. But Lena noticed something that made her chest do a strange and unfamiliar thing. He came back 2 minutes later for a second piece when he thought she was not watching. He took it quickly, almost guiltily, like a man who had forgotten he was allowed to enjoy anything. Lena turned back to her work table, a small smile pulling at her mouth. And then she saw her. A small ghost of a girl stood in the kitchen doorway. Dark hair hanging in tangles around a face too thin for a child her age. Eyes too large, too watchful, too old for a girl who could not have been more than 4. Her feet were bare on the cold floorboards despite the morning chill, her nightgown worn soft from too many washings. The child stared at Lena with an intensity that felt like being read in a language Lena had forgotten she knew. Neither of them moved, neither of them spoke. Lena's hands stilled in the dough, flour coating her fingers, her heart suddenly beating hard enough to hear. This had to be Mara. The girl studied Lena the way someone studies a door they are not sure they have permission to open. There was hunger in that look, but not the kind bread could fix. This was the hunger of a child who had been kept away from something essential and could not name what was missing. Mara. Caleb's voice came sharp from somewhere deeper in the house. "Where are you?" The girl vanished like smoke, silent as she had arrived. Lena heard Caleb's footsteps, heard him say something low that she could not make out, heard the creak of a door closing with a firmness that suggested a lock. A lock. But not the kind Lena had on her room. Not the kind that kept the world out. This was the other kind. The kind she knew too well. Lena went back to her kneading, but her hands shook now. A 4-year-old child, locked away from the kitchen, from the hired help, from anything that might resemble comfort or warmth, or the simple human kindness of fresh bread and a smile. She understood isolation. She understood being hidden. But she had been an adult when Evan had started shrinking her world, restricting her movements, deciding who she could speak to and when and how much. This child was learning those lessons in her bones before she even had words to name what was being taken from her. Lena shaped the dough with more force than necessary, anger threading through the repetitive motion. But anger was useless here. Anger would not keep her employed, would not keep her hidden, would not get her through the next 6 months until she could afford to run again. She had rules to follow. Caleb had been clear, and Lena had learned the price of breaking men's rules. So she baked, and when the next batch came out of the oven, she set aside one perfect roll, still warm, and wrapped it in a clean cloth. She carried it to the back stairs that led up to what she assumed were the bedrooms, and placed it carefully on the bottom step. If a small ghost wanted to find it, she would. If not, the ranch cat would have a fine breakfast. Lena asked for nothing in return, expected nothing, but she had learned something from her grandmother that Evan Rohr had tried to beat out of her and never quite managed. Kindness did not require permission. It only required courage. even when courage looked like nothing more than a warm roll on a cold step. That night, alone in her room with the door locked from the inside, Lena opened her carpet bag to unpack what little she had carried across 3 states. A spare dress, faded but clean. Her grandmother's worn Bible with pressed flowers between the pages of Psalms. A comb with 3 missing teeth. And beneath everything else, tucked into the bottom corner like a secret she could not bring herself to throw away, a handkerchief folded tight. The edges were stained brown with something she did not examine anymore. She unwrapped it carefully, her fingers steady from long practice. Inside sat a single bullet. Lead, slightly flattened on one side where it had struck the window frame 3 inches from her head the night she had run. She remembered the sound it made, the sharp crack of the pistol, then the thud of lead hitting wood, then the spray of splinters against her cheek as she threw herself through the broken window and into the darkness. She remembered Evan's voice behind her, cold and certain even as she fled. "You will never get far enough." Lena set the bullet on the windowsill where moonlight caught the dull metal. She looked at it for a long time, turning it over in her mind the way she turned dough in her hands, examining it from every angle. Some women kept lockets. Some kept pressed flowers or ribbons or letters tied with string. Lena kept the price of freedom where she could see it every morning and remember what she had survived to get here. A reminder that she was alive. That 7 miles and a locked door and a bullet on a windowsill were more than she had dared to hope for 8 months ago. She turned down the lamp and lay in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her. Wind against the windows, a horse shifting in the barn, the creak of old wood finding its nighttime voice. And just before sleep took her, she thought she heard something else, the softest sound. The creak of a stair-step, and then silence, and then the barely audible rustle of cloth being lifted and small feet padding quickly away. The roll was gone when she checked in the morning. In its place, the cloth was folded neatly on the step, and resting on top, placed with the deliberate care of someone who had spent a long time choosing, was a single red maple leaf. Lena picked it up and held it like it was the most valuable thing anyone had ever given her, because it was. Every morning the cloth came back folded on the bottom step, with something new resting on top, a white pebble smooth as river glass, a chicken feather still holding an iridescent sheen, a wildflower pressed flat and placed with care that spoke of hours spent choosing exactly the right one. Lena collected each gift in her apron pocket like talismans against the loneliness that threatened to swallow her during the long, silent afternoons. A growing collection of conversation conducted entirely without sound. She kept them in a small wooden box beneath her bed. The leaf, the pebble, the feather, a bit of blue yarn, a perfect acorn cap. Each one a word in a language she and Mara were inventing together. A language that needed no voice and broke no rules, because Caleb had said Lena could not interact with his daughter. He had not said anything about leaving bread on stairs. The first week passed in a rhythm as old as ranching itself. Lena rose before dawn and worked until her feet ached and her hands cramped. She learned the preferences of the 12 ranch hands. Dutch, the old foreman, liked his coffee strong enough to strip paint and took his bread plain with nothing on it. Sam, a young hand no more than 19 with an earnest face and a tendency to talk too much, avoided eggs but ate 3 biscuits at every meal. Reed, barely older than Sam but twice as clumsy, saved his bread for last like it was dessert, tearing it into small pieces and eating each one with his eyes closed. She learned the sounds of the house, which floorboards creaked when Caleb left for the far pastures before sunrise. The particular rattle of the supply wagon wheels on the road from town. The way the wind changed direction before weather moved in. And she learned about Mara through absence and echo. The gifts on the stairs grew more elaborate. Lena responded in kind, varying her offerings. A biscuit drizzled with honey. A cinnamon roll made from hoarded sugar that she could not really spare, but could not bring herself to withhold. A piece of cornbread with butter melted into its golden center, still warm enough to steam in the morning air. One morning, the gift waiting on the step was not a stone or a feather, but a drawing. Charcoal on brown paper, the lines crude but unmistakable. A large woman standing next to a stove, and beside her a very small girl. Lena had to grip the kitchen table to stay upright. Dutch was the first person at the ranch to really talk to her. Not about her past, not with questions that probed or pried, but about horses and weather, and the particular stubbornness of Montana soil. He had a way of saying things that carried more weight than the words themselves, as if every sentence had a room behind it that he was choosing not to open. "That is a fine-looking loaf," he said one morning, leaning against the kitchen doorway with his coffee. "My late wife made bread about half as good, and I told her it was the best in the territory every Sunday for 32 years. Lena smiled despite herself. Was it really only half as good? Dutch considered this with exaggerated seriousness. Maybe 3/4. But do not tell her ghost I said so. Woman could hold a grudge across the divide, and I would not put it past her." He was testing her, Lena realized, seeing if she could laugh, seeing if there was still something underneath the careful blankness she wore like armor. She was not sure herself until the laugh came, surprising them both. After that, Dutch found reasons to be in the kitchen during off hours. Not intruding, not asking, just present. Like a man who had decided something needed watching over and was content to do it quietly. One afternoon, while Lena was organizing supplies in the root cellar beneath the kitchen, she noticed something in the far corner. A dusty wooden crate larger than the others labeled in faded ink. Ranch documents, contracts, and deeds. It sat beneath a shelf of preserved tomatoes, half hidden by a pile of empty grain sacks. She did not open it, but she noted its location and filed the information away in the part of her mind that had learned to catalog everything. Exits and entrances, hiding places, things that might be useful later. You never knew when knowing where the paperwork was kept would matter. Caleb began eating breakfast with the hands instead of taking his coffee to the office he kept at the back of the house. He did not speak much during these meals, sat at the head of the table with his plate and his silence, and watched the men eat with an expression that was not quite satisfaction, but was no longer the flat emptiness Lena had seen on her first morning. Something in the house was shifting. She could feel it the way you feel weather changing before the clouds arrive. Dutch noticed too. One morning, Lena caught him watching Caleb watching her across the kitchen, and the old man's weathered face held something complicated. Recognition, maybe, or worry. The look of someone who had seen this particular story begin before and knew how it ended. "That girl," Dutch said to her later, his voice low enough that the words were meant only for her ears. They were standing by the barn, Lena hanging laundry on the line while Dutch mended a bridle. His tone was different now, careful, like a man handling something that might break. "That girl has not spoken since her mama died. 4 months now. Doc from Helena came out and examined her. Says maybe she never will." He paused, looked toward the house with eyes that had seen cavalry charges and cattle drives and every variety of human suffering the frontier could produce. "But this morning I saw her smile. First time in 4 months. Figured you should know what you're doing in there, even if you do not know you are doing it." Lena stood with a wet shirt in her hands and no idea what to say. She had not been trying to do anything. She had just been leaving bread on a step. Just been offering what she had because it was all she had and because a child was hungry for something that was not food. By late afternoon, the wind shifted. The western sky turned a sickly yellow-green, a color Lena had never seen in Ohio, but that her body understood before her mind caught up. Every instinct she had honed in 8 months of running said the same thing. Something is coming. Caleb rode in hard from the far pasture, dust and sweat on his horse, his face cut granite. He swung down from the saddle and spoke to Dutch in a voice Lena could hear from the kitchen window. "Storm. Big one. Coming in fast from the northwest. Get the hands to secure everything that is not nailed down. Move the yearlings from the south pasture to the barn corral. He paused then, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, lower, edged with something that did not belong in a conversation about weather. If I am not back by dark, do not let anyone outside, especially Mara. His voice cracked on his daughter's name. Just barely. Just enough for someone listening carefully to hear it break. Dutch nodded, his old eyes steady and understanding. And Lena, standing at the kitchen window with flour on her hands and a cold knot forming in her stomach, realized that whatever was coming was not just a storm. Caleb knew something about storms that had nothing to do with wind and rain, something that had broken him. And whatever it was, it lived in the space between his daughter's silence and his own. Montana storms do not knock. They kick the door in, tear loose everything that is not nailed down, and leave behind a world that does not recognize itself. Lena would learn that lesson before this night was over, but the lesson would not come from the wind. The afternoon went dark 2 hours before it should have. Not the gradual dimming of a normal evening, but a sudden smothering, as if someone had thrown a blanket over the sun and pulled it tight. Lena lit every lamp in the kitchen and checked the shutters twice. The wind started low, a moan that built to a howl that built to something that sounded almost human in its fury. The rain came all at once. Not drops, but sheets, like the sky itself had split open and poured everything it had been holding onto the ground below. Within minutes, the yard was a river of mud and the windows were blind with water, and the world had shrunk to the size of whatever you could reach with your hands. The ranch hands came in early, wet to the bone and grim-faced. Lena fed them soup and bread and watched them eat without their usual banter. Even Sam was quiet, his young face drawn with the particular tension of someone who has learned that the territory can kill you without warning and without apology. Dutch sat by the door with his rifle across his knees. Not because there was anything to shoot at, but because Dutch was the kind of man who felt better with a weapon close when the world was acting wrong. Caleb had not come back. Lena cleaned the supper dishes and tried not to think about what that meant. About a man out in this storm trying to secure outbuildings while the sky fell down around him. About the way his voice had cracked when he said his daughter's name. About the connection between storms and whatever lived behind his iron expression, that made his eyes look like a man standing at the edge of something he could not climb back from. And then she heard it. A small sound, thin as thread, nearly swallowed by the roar of wind and rain and the groaning of the house itself against the assault. But Lena's ears had been trained by 2 years of listening for sounds that meant danger, soft sounds, the creak of a floorboard that meant Evan was coming, the particular quality of breathing that meant he was angry. She had learned to hear things other people missed because missing them had consequences measured in bruises and broken bones. This sound was different, not dangerous, desperate. The high, thin keening of a child terrified beyond the capacity of her small body to contain it. Crying, coming from somewhere outside the house. Lena went still, her hands frozen in the dishwater. Every rational thought she possessed lined up in a neat row and told her the same thing. Do not go out there. Caleb had been clear. Mara was not her concern, not her responsibility. She was hired help, nothing more. She had rules to follow, boundaries to respect. Going out in this storm was dangerous. Going out to find a child she had been explicitly forbidden to interact with could cost her the only safe harbor she had found in 8 months of running. $12 a month. 6 months until she could afford to move further west. A locked door that kept the world out. A bed that was her own, safety, survival. The mathematics of staying alive when staying alive was all you had. The crying came again. Thinner now, more broken. The sound of someone very small who had given up on being heard but could not stop making noise because the fear was too big to hold inside. Lena grabbed a shawl from the hook by the door and ran. The rain hit her like fists, cold and relentless, driving against her face and soaking through her clothes in the time it took to cross the yard. She could barely see 3 feet in front of her. The world reduced to gray sheets of water, and the occasional flash of lightning that turned everything white as bone for one searing instant before plunging it back into darkness. The crying came from the barn. She was almost certain. She fought her way across the yard, her skirts heavy with mud, her boots sliding in the muck, her breath coming in gasps that the wind tore away before they reached her own ears. Twice she nearly fell. Twice she caught herself on fence posts she could not see, but found by instinct, by the desperate reaching of hands that refused to stop moving forward. The barn door hung open, banging against its frame with each gust. Inside was marginally better. The rain could not reach her here, but the wind found its way through every crack and gap in the timber walls, and the horses were wild-eyed and stamping in their stalls, agitated by the storm's fury. And there, huddled in the far corner against a pile of hay bales, so small she almost missed her entirely, was Mara. The child was soaked through, her nightgown plastered to her thin body, her dark hair hanging in wet ropes around a face that was not so much pale as translucent. She looked like something the storm had tried to erase. Her eyes found Lena's in the dim light, wide with a terror so absolute that it seemed to have erased everything else. She was not just frightened. She was somewhere beyond frightened, in a place where fear had consumed every other capacity and left nothing but the animal instinct to make yourself as small as possible and hope the danger passed. She did not speak. Lena had not heard her speak once since arriving at the ranch, but her small body shook with sobs that seemed too enormous for her frame to hold, silent cries that racked her chest and twisted her face into an expression no 4-year-old child should ever have to wear. Lena did not think. Thinking would have stopped her, would have reminded her of rules and boundaries, and $12 a month, and the careful mathematics of survival. Instead, she crossed the barn floor, lowered herself to the ground despite the dampness and the hay sticking to her wet clothes, and opened her arms. Mara hesitated for one single heartbeat. Just one. The span of time between one breath and the next, between one world and another. Then she launched herself into Lena's embrace with the desperate strength of someone who had been falling for a very long time and had finally found something solid to hold on to. Her small arms wrapped around Lena's neck and locked there. Her face buried itself against Lena's shoulder, pressed so hard into the wet fabric of her dress that Lena could feel the child's teeth through the cloth. And she cried. Not the thin keening of before, but the full-bodied sobs of someone who had been holding everything inside for months, for a lifetime, and had finally found a place where letting go felt safe enough to risk. "Shh," Lena murmured, her hand smoothing the child's tangled hair. "Shh, sweetheart. It is just weather, just noise. It cannot hurt you. I promise." It was a lie. Of course, storms could hurt. Storms could kill. But sometimes lies were the kindest thing you could offer. And Mara needed kindness more than truth right now. Lena began to hum. An old song her grandmother used to sing. Something about a garden and a valley and finding your way home. She had forgotten the words somewhere in the years between her grandmother's kitchen and this barn in the middle of nowhere. But the melody rose in her throat of its own accord, soft and low, competing with the thunder and the hammering rain and the wind that screamed like a living thing outside the walls. Mara's sobs gradually quieted. Her grip loosened slightly, going from desperate to merely tight. Her shaking eased. The small body in Lena's arms grew heavier as the tension bled away, and exhaustion replaced the fear, the particular heaviness of a child who has cried herself into the threshold of sleep. Lena kept humming, kept rocking gently, her back against the hay bales and the child in her lap, and the storm raging around them like the world was trying to tear itself apart. And in the midst of all that chaos, in the eye of all that fury, something impossibly quiet was happening. Something that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with two damaged hearts finding the same rhythm. She did not hear Caleb approach over the storm, did not know he was there until his shadow fell across them both, a flash of lightning turning him into a silhouette that could have been carved from the darkness itself. He stood in the barn doorway, soaked to the bone, water dripping from the brim of his hat, his face unreadable in the uncertain light. "I told you," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain, "not to interact with her." Lena held Mara closer, felt the child's grip tighten again at the sound of her father's voice, as if she expected to be pulled away. Lena held on. "I know, I gave you clear instructions." "You did." "Then why?" His voice cracked. Something breaking through that stone exterior, something raw and bleeding underneath. "Why could you not just follow the damn rules?" Lena looked up and met his eyes. This broken man standing in a broken doorway, in the middle of a storm that was breaking everything it touched. She saw his anger, and underneath it his terror, and underneath that something so lost and bewildered that it made her chest ache with recognition. She knew that expression. She had seen it in her own mirror every day for 2 years. The face of someone who had tried to do the right thing and failed so completely that they could not trust their own judgment anymore. "Because she needed someone," Lena said quietly. "And I was here." For a long moment, nothing happened. The storm raged. The horses stamped. Mara's breathing came in small hiccups against Lena's neck. And Caleb stood there, water streaming from his clothes, his fists clenched at his sides, fighting something invisible. Then something inside him gave way. Not his body, but the thing behind his body. The wall he had built between himself and everyone else, the fortress of guilt and grief and iron control that had kept him standing upright since the night his wife died. His shoulders dropped, his head bowed, his hands unclenched. "Her mother died in a storm like this," he said, and his voice was not hard anymore. It was barely there. A whisper that the wind almost stole before it reached Lena's ears. "She went into labor early. I rode for the doctor, but the bridge washed out. Creek flooded. I could not get across. I could hear her. Across the water, through the rain, I could hear her screaming for me. And I could not reach her." He paused, swallowed. The sound of a man trying to force words past something that did not want to move. "She died alone. While I was stuck on the wrong side of a swollen creek, she died alone in that house. And Mara was there. 3 years old, in the next room, listening to her mother die through the wall." The words settled into Lena's chest like stones dropped into deep water. She looked down at the child in her arms, this small survivor of incomprehensible loss, and understood finally why Caleb had built walls so thick and rules so rigid. He had watched his world end from the wrong side of a flooded creek, helpless and hearing everything, and when it was over, he had decided that the only way to prevent it from happening again was to prevent everything from happening. No connections, no warmth, no chance of loss because no chance of love. "I thought if I kept her away from things," Caleb continued, "from people, from anything that might remind her. I thought I was protecting her, but she stopped talking 3 months ago, and I do not." He trailed off. His jaw worked. "I do not know how to fix it." Lena met his eyes across the space between them, across the impossible distance between a man drowning in guilt and a woman drowning in fear, and said the truest thing she knew. "You cannot fix grief. You can only hold it until it decides to let go." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. This one had something growing in it, something fragile and green and too new to name. "Can you?" Caleb swallowed hard. "Can you stay with her tonight? Just tonight?" "I cannot." "The storm. I will stay with her as long as she needs me." Relief crossed his face, and something else underneath it. Something that looked like gratitude or possibly fear or possibly the first crack in a dam that had been holding too much back for too long. He nodded once, sharp and short, turned, and walked back into the storm. Lena held Mara as the rain pounded the barn roof and the wind screamed its fury and the world outside tried its level best to tear itself apart. She hummed her grandmother's song and felt the child's breathing gradually slow, felt the small body relax into sleep, felt the tiny fist that gripped her collar loosen finger by finger until it was holding on from trust rather than desperation. When Caleb returned an hour later, he brought blankets and a lantern. His movements were careful and quiet, the movements of a man trying not to break something delicate. He set the lantern on an overturned bucket and draped a blanket over Lena and Mara both, his hands gentle in a way that seemed to surprise even himself. His hand hovered over his daughter's head, just hovered there, inches from her dark hair, trembling slightly. Then it withdrew without making contact, as if he had forgotten how to touch her, as if he was afraid that touching her would hurt them both. "Thank you," he said, and the words came out rough as unfinished wood, scraped raw and honest and painful to hear. Lena just nodded because words would not come. There was too much in her chest, too many things she could not name pressing against her ribs, and if she opened her mouth, she was afraid of what might escape. Caleb settled against the opposite wall, his long legs stretched out, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He did not sleep either. Lena could tell by his breathing, by the tension that never fully left his shoulders, by the way he kept lifting his head to check on them both whenever the storm surged louder. They stayed that way through the night. A broken man, a hidden woman, and a silent child. Weathering the storm together in a barn that smelled of hay and horses, and the particular loneliness of people who were just beginning to learn that reaching for each other across the dark was possible. By morning, the rain had stopped. The world emerged washed clean, every color somehow brighter and more defined, as if the storm had scrubbed the landscape down to its essence and left only what was real. Mara stirred and opened her eyes and looked at Lena with something that might have been trust. Then she carefully untangled herself, crossed the barn floor on bare feet, and went to her father. Caleb gathered her up, his arms finally remembering their purpose, wrapping around his daughter with the careful strength of someone handling something infinitely precious. He stood and settled her on his hip, and her small head dropped against his shoulder, with the particular bonelessness of a child who feels completely safe. He carried her toward the barn door, toward the morning light that was pouring through the opening in shafts of gold. At the threshold, he paused, turned, looked back at Lena, still sitting in the hay with straw in her hair and tear tracks on her cheeks and everything she felt written across her face for anyone to read. "The bread," he said. "The rolls you have been leaving on the stairs. That stops now." Lena's heart sank straight to her boots. She had known this was coming, had known from the moment she ran out into the storm that she was choosing compassion over survival, and that the price would be exactly this. "I understand," she said quietly. "Because," Caleb continued, and his voice changed, dropped to something that was almost gentle, almost tender, a register she had not heard from him before, and that made her breath catch in her throat. "Because she will be eating breakfast with everyone else, in the kitchen, where she belongs." Then he walked into the morning light with his daughter on his shoulder, leaving Lena sitting in the hay with tears streaming down her face and something dangerous and beautiful and terrifying blooming in her chest. The thing she had sworn 8 months ago she would never let herself feel again, because feeling it meant risking everything, and she had already lost so much. Hope, foolish, stubborn, impossible hope, rising in her like bread dough, like morning light, like the first green shoot pushing through frozen ground. She sat there for a long time, letting it grow. The old stone oven behind the house collapsed on a Tuesday afternoon, and Lena looked at the ruins and saw a future. That was the most dangerous thing she had done yet. Not rebuilding the oven, but allowing herself to want something beyond mere survival. Want was a luxury that people like her could not afford. Want was the door through which disappointment always entered. But standing there with the October sun warm on her face and the pile of rubble at her feet, Lena wanted anyway. "Could you fix it?" She startled at Caleb's voice behind her. He had a habit of appearing without sound, moving through his own land with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged to it as much as it belonged to him. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, squinting at the collapsed oven like he was assessing a problem with livestock or fence line. "I could," she said carefully. I would need help with the heavy stone, and mortar, and fire brick if it can be had. Make me a list. I will get what you need from the supply wagon. It is not necessary. The kitchen stove works fine for bread and biscuits. Caleb looked at her then. Really looked, with that rare, full attention that made her feel visible in ways that still frightened her. Like he was seeing not just the woman standing in front of him, but the woman she might become if someone gave her the chance. I have been thinking, he said. There is only one other bakery between here and Billings, and their bread tastes like punishment. If you could produce more with a proper oven, we could sell to the mining camps, the logging sites, maybe even get a contract with the fort. Lena's mind raced. That is not just cooking for the ranch. That is a business. It is a living. A better one than $12 a month. He walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing in the ruins of the old oven, with something that felt dangerously close to a future taking shape in her mind. Like bread dough that had finally been given the right temperature and the right amount of time. Rising. The supplies came on the next wagon. Fire brick and mortar, trowels and levels. Dutch and two of the younger hands, Sam and Reed, volunteered their afternoons to help with the construction. They worked in the lengthening autumn light, mixing mortar and laying brick, while Mara sat nearby drawing pictures in the dirt with a stick. The child had taken her place at the kitchen table that very first morning after the storm, still silent but present. Her dark eyes watched everything with careful attention, cataloging the world around her with the seriousness of a tiny scholar. She did not speak, but she communicated in other ways. A nod for yes, a shake for no. Drawings left on the table that showed houses and people and sometimes horses running across fields of scribbled grass. And she smiled. Small, careful smiles that seemed to cost her something each time, as if she was spending a currency she had very little of and wanted to make sure each expenditure was worth it. The ranch hands adapted to her presence with a grace that surprised Lena. They spoke a little softer when Mara was at the table, saved the rougher stories for the bunkhouse, and Dutch took to carving small wooden animals during his breaks and leaving them by her plate. A horse, a cow, a chicken that looked more like a deformed sparrow, but made Mara's mouth twitch in what was definitely, unmistakably, a smile. Reed's trowel slipped on the third day of construction, cutting a deep gash across his forearm. Blood welled up bright and shocking. The boy swore and grabbed his arm and went pale as milk. Lena did not think. She tore a strip from her apron, bound the wound tight, and barked orders about clean water and whiskey for cleaning. Her hands were steady even as Reed swayed on his feet, even as Dutch grabbed the boy's weight to keep him upright. She cleaned the wound and wrapped it proper, and did not flinch at the blood. "You have done this before," Dutch observed, watching her work with eyes that missed nothing. "My grandmother raised me. She was the closest thing to a doctor in our town." The words came out before Lena could stop them. A slip of truth she had meant to keep hidden. "Useful skill," Dutch said, "nothing more." But his eyes held a question she did not answer. They finished the oven a week later, just as the first serious cold arrived. The inaugural firing was something close to ceremony. All 12 ranch hands gathered to watch as Lena built the fire inside the stone chamber, as the bricks absorbed heat, as the temperature climbed to the precise point where flour and water and salt and thyme would transform into something holy. The loaves that emerged that evening made the kitchen bread look ordinary, crust like shattering glass, interior soft as clouds. The kind of bread that made people close their eyes when they bit into it, made them remember every good meal they had ever eaten and every person who had ever cared enough to feed them well. "Lord in heaven," Sam breathed, his mouth full. "This is better than my mama's, and I will deny saying that to my grave if any of you tells her." The men laughed, a sound that had become more common in recent weeks, as if the ranch itself was remembering how to breathe. Caleb ate his piece slowly, considering each bite with the careful attention he gave to everything that mattered. Then he looked at Lena with an expression she could not quite read. "We will need to get you a wagon," he said. And a route. Dutch knows every settlement and mining camp within 50 miles. He can help you plan. That night, Lena sat at the kitchen table and let herself imagine it. A real business. Income she controlled. A reason to stay that had nothing to do with running away and everything to do with running toward. The numbers she scratched on paper with a borrowed pencil were small and rough, but they added up to something enormous. Not just money, freedom. The kind you build with your own two hands because nobody is ever going to hand it to you. The first delivery run left the ranch before sunrise on a Tuesday morning that smelled of coming snow. Lena sat beside Dutch on the wagon bench, her hands gripping the edge of the seat as the wheels found their rhythm on the rutted road. Behind them, wrapped in oilcloth and stacked with care, rode 200 loaves of bread. Everything the stone oven had produced in 3 days of continuous firing. Dutch did not speak much, which suited Lena fine. He guided the horses with the ease of someone who had traveled these roads so many times he could do it blind. His weathered face betrayed nothing of what he thought about hauling bread across the territory with a woman who jumped at sudden sounds. The first stop was Silver Ridge, a mining camp clinging to a hillside like it was not sure it wanted to stay. Men emerged from bunkhouses and tents, their faces registering surprise when they saw Lena climbing down from the wagon seat. "Fresh bread," Dutch announced, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man who expected to be heard. "Best you will taste this side of the Mississippi. 2 loaves for $1. A big man with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow stepped forward, arms crossed. "That is steep for bread, old-timer. Then do not buy it," Dutch said mildly. "But you will be thinking about it come supper when you are choking down whatever paste your cook calls biscuits." Lena unwrapped one of the loaves, broke off a piece, and held it out. "Try it first. If it is not worth $1, we will move on." The scarred man took the bread with thick fingers, bit into it, and stopped. His expression shifted from skepticism to something that looked almost religious. He chewed slowly, swallowed, looked at the piece remaining in his hand like it might disappear. "I will take 10, he said. They sold out in 20 minutes. At the third camp, a man called from the back of the crowd with something crude about Lena and special deliveries. Dutch set down the loaf he had been wrapping and turned slowly until he faced the heckler. His old eyes were steady and cold as creek water in January. "That is Mrs. Hart to you," he said, quiet but carrying. "And she is under the protection of the Wright Ranch. You understand what that means?" The laughter died like a candle in wind. The heckler took a step back. "Did not mean nothing by it. See that you do not." Mrs. Hart. The name settled strange in Lena's chest. A lie that felt like armor. She had never been anyone's Mrs. Anything, had never belonged to someone in a way that came with protection instead of ownership. The title was fiction, but it covered her like a shield, and she was grateful for it even as it reminded her that she was still hiding, still pretending to be someone she was not. $143. Lena counted the coins 3 times on the ride home, unable to believe the weight of them in her apron pocket. More money than she had ever held at once. Money she had earned with her own hands through her own skill, and not been given as allowance or charity or payment for services that had nothing to do with bread. On the ride home, Dutch was quiet for a long time. The horses walked steady, and the wagon creaked, and the Montana landscape stretched out around them in every direction, vast and indifferent and beautiful. Then Dutch spoke. "Caleb built that ranch from nothing. Him and Martha starting with scrubland and stubbornness. His family back east disowned him when he married her. Said she was not quality enough for a Wright. He came out here with nothing but her and determination and proved every one of them wrong." He paused, adjusted the reins. "I have known him since before Mara, since before Martha even. Watched him build that place board by board and fence post by fence post. Watched him fall in love with a woman his family said he should not want, and marry her anyway, because Caleb Wright has never in his life done what he was supposed to do, when what he was supposed to do was wrong." Dutch was leading somewhere with this. Lena could feel it. "And I watched him survive losing her. Was not sure he would for a while. Man walked around like a ghost in his own house, going through the motions of living without actually doing any of it. Then you showed up and that girl started healing. And I thought maybe there is still hope for stubborn men and second chances. Dutch. Lena did not know what to say. But there is something you should know. Dutch's voice changed again, went quieter, more careful. Like a man stepping onto ice he was not sure would hold. That bridge, the one that washed out the night Martha died. I rode across it 100 times over the years. White oak pilings sunk deep into bedrock, good construction. That bridge held through floods and ice jams and every kind of weather this territory could throw at it. He was quiet for a long beat. The wagon wheels turned. The horses breathed. There is no earthly reason for it to collapse in a storm like that. No earthly reason at all. He said nothing more. Did not name anyone. Did not offer theories or accusations. Just let the words sit in the cold air between them, heavy with implication. Lena felt something shift inside her, a question forming in the dark, shapeless and unsettling, that she did not yet have enough information to ask. But the question was there now, and questions, once planted, had a way of growing until they demanded answers. That evening, Caleb met them in the yard as the golden light turned the ranch amber and the shadows stretched long across the ground. Mara sat on his shoulders, her small hands gripping his hair for balance, her face bright with an eagerness that Lena had not seen before. The child's eyes found Lena the moment the wagon turned into the yard, and her mouth curved in something that was unmistakably, irrevocably, a smile. Caleb noticed. Something flickered across his face, raw and unguarded, before he locked it away behind his usual expression. But Lena had seen it, that flicker, that crack in the wall. And she knew that what she had seen was not irritation or discomfort. It was longing. "How did it go?" he asked, as if the answer was about bread and money and business routes. But his eyes asked something else entirely, and Lena pretended not to hear. "Sold out," she said. "Every loaf. Good." His mouth almost smiled. "Be ready to do it again Friday. Word will spread fast." He turned toward the house with Mara still on his shoulders, the child's small hand waving at Lena over her father's head, a gesture of farewell that was also a promise. "I will be here when you get back. I will always be here." Lena waved in return and stood in the fading light and felt the dangerous thing in her chest grow a little larger, a little harder to ignore, a little more like something she might not be able to live without. Caleb Wright had developed a dangerous habit, watching Lena when she did not know he was looking. He did not realize he was doing it until Dutch cleared his throat in the barn doorway one morning and said in that dry way of his that could have been humor or could have been a warning, "You are staring at that woman like a man dying of thirst stares at water. She has not noticed yet. But I have." Caleb turned away and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not make it worse. Dutch was right. He was watching. Had been watching for weeks now, finding reasons to be in the kitchen during baking hours, asking Lena's opinion about matters that had nothing to do with bread, fence placement, cattle prices, whether the weather was going to break before the first hard freeze. She answered each question with the careful consideration of someone who had learned that her opinions mattered to exactly no one, and was still surprised every time someone asked for them. That surprise gutted him every time he saw it. The slight widening of her eyes, the brief hesitation before she spoke, as if she was testing the ground to make sure it would hold her weight before she stepped forward. Who had taught this woman that her thoughts were worthless? Who had convinced her that her voice did not deserve to be heard? He knew the answer. She had told him during those long hours repairing fence line on a cold October afternoon, when the truth had come out not in a rush but in pieces, pulled free by the rhythm of physical labor, like splinters worked loose from a wound that had never properly healed. They had been digging post holes and stringing wire side by side in the biting wind, breath misting between them. He had noticed how she flinched when a strand of barbed wire snapped free from its post with a sharp metallic twang. Not a startled flinch, a different kind. the practiced duck of someone whose body had learned to anticipate pain from sudden movements and sounds. The kind of flinch you only develop through repetition. He had not asked directly, had just kept working, kept digging, kept being present. And after a while, in the way that truth sometimes escapes when your hands are busy and your guard is down, she had started talking. His name was Evan Rohr. She said it to the fence post she was steadying, not to Caleb. He convinced me I needed him, that no one else would want me looking the way I do. By the time I understood what he really was, it was too late. He controlled everything. My money, my movement, who I spoke to. When I tried to leave the first time, She stopped, drove the post deeper with a force that had nothing to do with fence construction. He made it clear that leaving would have consequences. Caleb's hands had tightened on the wire until the barbs bit through his gloves. He kept his voice level because losing control right now would help no one. But you left anyway. I got lucky. He went to Denver on business. I took what I could carry and ran. I have been running for 8 months, changing my name, staying in places where no one asks questions. Montana seemed far enough, remote enough. I thought I could disappear. This is my land. Caleb drove the next post into the ground with enough force to bury it 6 inches deeper than necessary. What is mine, I protect. That includes hired help who make better bread than I have tasted in 5 years, and who held my daughter through a storm when I could not. He drove the post again. The impact traveled up through his arms and settled somewhere in his chest. You are not disappearing, Lena. You are building something. There is a difference. She had looked at him then. Really looked, the way she so rarely did, meeting his eyes instead of glancing away. And what he saw in her face was not gratitude or relief, but something more complicated, more dangerous. The expression of someone standing at the edge of trust and trying to decide if the ground on the other side was solid enough to hold. Now, weeks later, the bakery was growing like yeast in warm water. Sarah Dawson had joined the operation, a quiet woman with strong arms and a baby perpetually riding her hip. Margaret Boone came next, the wife of one of the hands, sharp-tongued and efficient with opinions about everything and the skill to back them up. And Ruth Whitfield, a widow from town who had once run her own bakery, and who arrived with her own rolling pin and a personality that could strip paint. The kitchen hummed with activity from before dawn until well past dark. Flour dust coated every surface. The air was thick with yeast and heat and the particular exhaustion of work that mattered. Mara sat at the kitchen table every morning, shaping dough scraps into small loaves that Lena baked alongside the real ones. The child still did not speak, but her presence filled the kitchen with something essential that no one could name. She communicated in gestures and expressions, and the small drawings she left on the table like notes in a conversation only she and Lena fully understood. One morning, Mara tugged on Lena's skirt while she was pulling a tray from the oven. Lena looked down to find the child holding up a misshapen lump of baked dough, her expression uncertain, hopeful, afraid. "That is beautiful," Lena said, crouching down until they were eye to eye. "Is it for me?" Mara nodded. "Then I am keeping it forever." Lena took the small loaf, still warm, and pressed it against her heart. "Right here, where all the important things go." Mara's smile broke across her face like sunrise, sudden and bright and overwhelming. The child threw her arms around Lena's neck, held tight for 3 heartbeats, then scampered away toward the yard, leaving Lena crouching on the kitchen floor with a lump of burnt dough pressed to her chest, and tears she did not bother to hide. Caleb stood in the kitchen doorway, watching. His expression was something Lena could not read, layers of emotion stacked so deep that the surface showed nothing but stillness. "She is getting better," he said quietly. "She is. Because of you." Lena shook her head, turning back to her work. "Because she is ready. Children heal when they feel safe enough to try. And you made her feel safe." It was not a question. That evening, as the light faded and the household settled into its nighttime rhythm, Caleb's hand found Lena's shoulder, the first deliberate, purposeful touch between them. his palm warm through the fabric of her dress. His grip gentle but certain, the touch of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and was doing it anyway despite every voice in his head telling him not to. Lena did not pull away, did not flinch, did not shrink. She stood still and felt his hand on her shoulder and realized what terrified her was not his touch. It was how badly she did not want it to leave. He withdrew after a moment, nodded to her like they had agreed on something without saying a word, and walked out to check the barn. His boots were heavy on the porch boards, but his step was lighter than she had ever heard it. Lena watched him go. This man who gave compliments like they cost him blood, who kept his grief strapped down so tight it had become part of his posture, who was learning, slowly and painfully, to reach for something beyond survival. She understood him. God help her, she understood him completely, because she was doing the same thing. That night, Lena returned to her room off the kitchen and stopped in the doorway. Her blood went cold. On her windowsill, next to the bullet she kept as a reminder of the night she had run, sat something that had not been there when she left that morning. A ring, small and gold, with a tiny chip of garnet in a plain setting. She recognized it instantly. The engagement ring Evan Rohr had forced onto her finger 2 years ago. The ring she had left behind on the kitchen table the night she fled because it was his, and she wanted nothing of his touching her skin ever again. Someone had been in her room, inside the house, while she was outside working fence line with Caleb, while every door was unlocked because this was a ranch in the middle of Montana and nobody locked doors during the day because there was nobody to lock them against. She picked the ring up with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else, turned it in the lamplight. Inside the band, the old engraving she remembered, "Forever Yours." But beneath it, scratched deep and rough into the gold with something sharp, was a new message. "I will find you." Lena set the ring down beside the bullet on the windowsill. 2 pieces of metal, 2 kinds of chains. One she had chosen to carry, the other had found her. She locked her door, sat with her back against the wall and thought about the kitchen knife in the drawer 6 steps away. Not to harm herself, to be ready. Because whoever had come close enough to place a ring on her windowsill had come close enough to open her door. And next time, they might. Evan Rohr never arrived anywhere without preparing the ground first. He sent fear ahead of him like a herald, and last night the herald had delivered its message perfectly. Lena did not tell Caleb about the ring. The decision was not rational. It was instinct, the deep animal instinct of someone who had spent 2 years learning that asking for help was the fastest way to lose it. Telling Caleb meant admitting Evan was close. Admitting Evan was close meant becoming a danger to this household, to Mara, to everything she had started building. And Caleb, being the kind of man he was, might decide the safest thing for his daughter was to remove the source of the threat, to send Lena away. She could not risk that. Not now. Not when Mara was finally eating breakfast at the kitchen table and smiling at the ranch hands and drawing pictures that included a large woman with red-brown hair standing next to a stove. Not when the bakery was bringing in more money each week and the route was expanding and the future was starting to look like something other than a series of places to run from. So she told Dutch instead. The old foreman listened without interrupting while Lena showed him the ring and explained what the engraving meant. His weathered face went still in a way that told her he was not surprised. He had been expecting something like this. Maybe not this specifically, but something. The shoe he had been waiting to drop. He checked the perimeter of the house that afternoon while Lena worked in the kitchen, her knife within arm's reach for the first time since arriving at the ranch. When Dutch came back, his expression was grim. Boot prints beneath your window. Not ranch boots. City leather. Expensive. Dress shoes, not working shoes. He leaned his rifle against the kitchen wall, positioning it where they could both reach it. He hired someone. Would not come himself. Too risky, too far from his home ground. But he wanted you to know he is watching. Dutch settled his hat more firmly on his head. I will sleep in the barn the next few nights. Keep an eye on things. Dutch, you do not have to. Girl, I was keeping watch before you were born. Besides, his old eyes softened slightly, I made a promise to look after this place. That includes the people in it. The next blow came 2 days later. 2 of the northern mining camps canceled their standing bread orders. No explanation given beyond vague excuses about cost-cutting and finding local suppliers. But when Dutch rode out to investigate, the foreman at Silver Ridge told him the truth over a whiskey. Some fellow came through, asking questions about the Wright Ranch, saying you all were in financial trouble, might not be able to deliver reliable. Suggested we find other suppliers before the whole operation went belly up. Evan was not just watching. He was destroying her business from a distance, cutting the threads she had woven one by one, making sure that whatever she built he could tear down without getting his hands dirty. It was exactly how he had operated in Ohio. Never direct when indirect would serve. Never a fist when a whisper would do the same damage. Lena was still absorbing this when Grant Hale arrived. He rode into the ranch yard on a horse too fine for working country, his clothes too expensive for any practical purpose, handsome in a way that set Lena's teeth on edge. All confidence and easy charm, the kind of man who had never been told no and would not have recognized the word if it bit him. He dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who had grown up with horses and money, both assumed as birthright rather than earned. He clasped Caleb's hand on the porch like they were old friends. But the tension in Caleb's shoulders said otherwise. Their conversation carried through the cold air, fragments that Lena caught through the kitchen window while she kneaded dough with hands that shook. Water rights, legal claim, $5,000. 30 days or I file through the territorial court. Previous owner signed a contract. Payment in full or seizure proceedings. When Hale left, riding out with a tip of his hat that dripped mockery, Caleb came inside with a face the color of ash. Grant Hale owns the land upstream from us, he said, his voice flat with the careful control of a man very close to breaking something. He is claiming I owe him for water usage. Says there is a contract the previous owner signed giving him authority to charge fees. $5,000, 30 days, $5,000. The number hit Lena like a physical blow, an impossible sum. Can he do that? If the contract exists and is legal, maybe. And even if it is not, fighting it through the territorial court would cost nearly as much and take months. He could cut off our water access in the meantime, claim we are in violation, make it impossible to run the ranch. Lena's mind was already working, connections forming in the dark where conscious thought had not yet reached. The timing, the ring on her windowsill 3 days ago, customers being scared off, and now this. 3 attacks at once from different angles, arriving in sequence like a military campaign. This was not coincidence. This was coordination. She did not say it aloud. Not yet. Not until she had proof. But the question Dutch had planted on the wagon ride home weeks ago was growing now, pushing up through the soil of her suspicion toward the light. What she said instead was this. What if we could raise it? The 5,000. Caleb looked at her like she had suggested they sprout wings. Lena, that is more money than the bakery brings in for a whole season. Not yet. But what if we expanded? Hit every camp, every settlement, every town within 100 miles. What if we took everything we can make, not just bread, but pies and cakes and specialty items that command higher prices? What if we worked every single day for the next month? You would kill yourself. The pace you are keeping now is already. I have survived worse than hard work. Lena moved toward him, urgency flooding her veins. Caleb, this ranch is Mara's home. It is the place where she is healing, where she feels safe. It is your home. She paused, swallowed past the tightness in her throat. And it is mine too. Or it is starting to be. And I am not letting some rich bastard take it because he thinks he can. Something fierce lit in Caleb's eyes. Even if we could produce enough, I cannot ask you to. You are not asking. I am offering. We all are. Dutch, Sarah, Margaret. This ranch is more than your livelihood. It is all of ours. We fight for it together or we lose it together. But either way, we decide." Caleb stared at her for a long moment. Then he cupped her face with one calloused hand and looked at her with an expression that held too many things to name. Gratitude and fear, and something deeper, something that glowed like coals in his gray-blue eyes. "Thank you," he said, "for staying, for caring, for being exactly who you are." They mobilized that night. Sarah brought her sister Anna. Margaret arrived before dawn with her sleeves already rolled. The kitchen became a war room, flour and strategy in equal measure. And 3 days into the campaign at 2 in the morning, with Lena's arms screaming and her back a solid line of fire, a knock came at the kitchen door. She grabbed the knife, crept forward, opened the door. Ruth Whitfield stood in the darkness, her own rolling pin tucked under one arm, and disapproval etched into every line of her face. "Your dough is too wet," Ruth said flatly, pushing past Lena into the kitchen like she owned it. "Bread will be dense. Add flour. Work it longer." She hung up her coat, tied on an apron, and began examining the rising loaves with the critical eye of a woman who had forgotten more about baking than most people would ever learn. "There is no time to make time or make bad bread," Ruth announced. "Choose." Lena chose to add flour. And for the first time in days, she laughed. Lena stopped counting days and started counting in sensory details instead. The crack in her left thumb that would not close no matter how much salve she applied. The permanent flour dust in her hair that no amount of washing could remove. The way her dresses hung looser each week, the fabric gathering where it had once pulled tight. Until Margaret threatened to pin them shut with horseshoe nails if Lena did not stand still long enough for proper alterations. She could not remember the last time she had slept more than 3 hours straight. Could not recall the last meal she had eaten sitting down. Every thought was measured in pounds of flour and dollars earned and the shrinking distance between where they were and where they needed to be. The kitchen ran around the clock now, 2 shifts rotating, one team on the indoor stove, the other manning the stone oven outside despite the November cold. Sarah and Anna mixed dough in 3-hour blocks, while Margaret shaped loaves with the mechanical efficiency of a woman who had found a fight worth fighting. Ruth inspected every pie crust like it was standing trial, and found most of them guilty of insufficient precision. "Too thin here." Ruth pointed at a section of crust that looked identical to every other section to Lena's exhausted eyes, and overworked there. "Pie crust is not bread. You cannot bully it into submission. You have to convince it. I am not bullying it. You are manhandling that dough like it owes you money. Ease up. Let it breathe." Lena eased up. The next crust came out flaky and perfect. Ruth nodded once, the highest praise she offered, and moved on to the next station without another word. In the quiet hours between shifts, when the kitchen was briefly still and the ovens were banking heat for the next firing, Ruth found Lena sitting at the table staring at numbers that blurred in front of her tired eyes. The older woman poured 2 cups of coffee, sat down across from her, and spoke without preamble. "That man, the one you are running from. He ever tell you that you were not good enough? That nobody else would want you?" Lena's breath caught. "How did you know?" "Because I know the signs. Seen them before. In other women." Ruth's hands wrapped around her coffee cup, her knuckles swollen with age and work. "In myself, long time ago." She drank her coffee and let the silence between them fill with the things words could not hold. "My first husband was like that," Ruth continued. "Made me small, kept me afraid. Told me I was lucky to have him because who else would want a woman with a sharp tongue and no patience for fools? When he died, I thought I would be relieved. Instead, I was lost. Did not know who I was without someone telling me. What did you do? Baked bread, opened a shop, failed. Started again, failed again. Finally figured out that failing was not the same as being a failure. That I could be afraid and still try. That my worth was not determined by his opinion or anyone else's." Ruth set down her cup and looked at Lena with eyes that held no pity, only recognition. "You are doing the same thing, whether you know it or not. building something, becoming someone. Do not let fear steal that from you. But what if he finds me? Then you deal with it. With these people who have become your family. In this place you have made your home. You do not run anymore, Lena. You stand. On the 22nd day, the thing Lena had been dreading happened. Not from outside, but from within. She was standing at the work table when Dutch delivered the news. A third camp had canceled orders. Another one of Evan's whisper campaigns. Another business poisoned from a distance by a man who could not stand the idea that she was building something without him. Something successful. Something that proved every lie he had ever told her was just that. A lie. The numbers in Lena's head spun and crashed. They were behind schedule now. The lost revenue from 3 canceled camps meant they would have to sell more, farther, faster, with no margin for error and no room for rest. She looked at the tray of fresh bread cooling on the counter. Perfect loaves, golden and beautiful. And something inside her snapped. She picked up the tray and hurled it at the wall. The crash was enormous. Loaves exploded against the plaster, scattering crust and crumb across the floor. The tray clattered and spun. Flour and fragments rained down like the aftermath of a small and senseless war. Silence. Lena stood with her empty hands shaking and her chest heaving and the echoes of the crash ringing in her ears. And then she turned. Mara stood in the doorway. The child's eyes were wide, her body frozen in the exact posture of a small creature that has learned what sudden violence means. Not confused, not startled, afraid. With the specific practiced fear of someone who recognizes this particular pattern, noise and impact and the unpredictable fury of an adult who has lost control. Mara took a step backward. One step, that was all. But it was the worst step Lena had ever witnessed, because she recognized what it meant. She had taken that same step herself 1,000 times. The retreat, the making yourself small, the preparation for whatever came next, because whatever came next was never good. And in that terrible moment, Lena saw herself not as the woman who had survived Evan Roar, but as the woman who carried him inside her. His rage, his loss of control, his willingness to destroy something beautiful, because the world was not cooperating. She had thrown bread at a wall and terrified a child who had already been taught to fear exactly this. She dropped to her knees. "I am sorry." The words came broken and raw. "Mara, I am so sorry. I should not have done that. I was angry and scared, and I took it out on the bread instead of using my words. That was wrong." Mara studied her. 4 years old, and already too wise about the ways people could break. Her dark eyes moved from Lena's face to the bread on the floor, to the mark on the wall where the tray had struck and back again. Processing, deciding. Then she walked into the kitchen, crossed the flour-strewn floor on bare feet, picked up one of the fallen loaves, brushed it carefully against her nightgown to clean it, and placed it back on the work table. She turned to Lena and patted her cheek with one small flour-dusted hand. Forgiveness, wordless and complete, given freely by a child who had every reason to withhold it. Lena wept, not pretty crying, but ugly, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. Because the damage Evan had done was not just in her scars and her nightmares and her flinch response. It was in her, part of her. The rage was his inheritance, and she was going to carry it for the rest of her life. But carrying it was not the same as letting it win. Later that afternoon, after Lena had cleaned the mess and steadied herself and apologized again to Mara with words she hoped the child could feel, even if she could not fully understand, she sat beside Mara at the small table in the kitchen corner. The child was working dough with unusual intensity, her small hands pressing and shaping with more focus than Lena had ever seen. Her brow was furrowed, her jaw tight. Then Mara opened her mouth. Her lips moved, her throat worked, tendons standing out in her small neck with the effort, shapes forming, air pushing through, everything happening that was supposed to happen except the sound. No sound came out, just a whisper of breath, just the ghost of words that had been locked away for 4 months and were fighting to break free. Mara's face crumpled with frustration, her eyes filled with tears. The effort of trying and failing was somehow worse than not trying at all. Lena knelt beside her, did not push, did not coax, just placed her hand gently on the child's back and said softly, "It is okay, sweetheart. When you are ready, no rush." Mara's jaw clenched one more time with effort so fierce it made her whole body tremble. Then she slumped against Lena's chest in defeat, her small hands gripping Lena's dress, her breathing ragged with the exhaustion of a battle she had almost won. But Lena had seen it, had felt the wall crack. Whatever was holding Mara's voice prisoner was losing its grip. And one day soon, the words would come, like water through a breaking dam. That same day, in the late afternoon light, Caleb found Lena and took her hand and led her up the gentle rise behind the ranch house. The place where you could see the whole valley spread out below, mountains touching the horizon in every direction. The ranch small and sturdy against all that vastness. "Martha and I used to come up here," he said. "When things got hard, she always said looking at all that space made our problems feel smaller." Was she right? Sometimes. Sometimes it just made me feel small. But right now... He turned to face Lena, and his expression was open in a way she had rarely seen, unguarded and raw and brave. "Looking at this view with you, knowing what we have built together these past months, I think she was right. We are small, our problems are small, but what we are fighting for, that is huge. That matters." He took both her hands. His were rough and warm and steady. "I love you, Lena. I have probably loved you since you held Mara through that storm and looked at me like I was the one who needed saving." Before Lena could respond, before she could find words for the enormity of what he was saying and what she wanted to say back, Sam came running up the hill, breathless and pale. "Boss, north fence is down, whole section. Cattle drifting toward Hale's land. We need you now." Caleb closed his eyes, drew one long breath, squeezed Lena's hands once, hard. "We are not done with this conversation," he said. Then he released her and was gone, striding down the hill with Sam, leaving Lena standing in the golden light with her heart hammering and his words echoing in her chest like church bells. That night she could not sleep. Not because of Caleb's declaration, though that alone would have been enough to keep her staring at the ceiling until dawn, but because she had work to do. Bakery, accounting. The fort had expressed interest in a regular supply contract, and to finalize the paperwork she needed records of consistent production costs. Old receipts that might be filed somewhere in the ranch's records. The crate in the root cellar, the one she had noticed weeks ago and filed away. She lit a lamp and descended the narrow stairs, found the crate in its corner, still half hidden beneath grain sacks, lifted the lid and began sorting through decades of accumulated paper. Deeds, cattle receipts, tax records, correspondence with suppliers. She was looking for feed and flour invoices, anything that would document the ranch's purchasing history. What she found instead changed everything. A letter, yellowed with age but not old, dated 3 months before Lena had arrived at the ranch, written in a careful, businesslike hand on expensive stationery. The return address was local, Grant Hale's ranch. But it was addressed to a name that turned Lena's blood to ice. E. Roar, Ohio. She read it twice, 3 times. Each time the words sinking deeper, connecting to other words, other moments, building a picture that was simultaneously shocking and inevitable. "The subject has been located in Montana Territory, employed at the Wright Ranch. Will proceed as discussed. Looking forward to our mutual benefit regarding the water rights matter. Your assistance in the legal proceedings will be most welcome." Hale and Evan knew each other, had been corresponding, had planned this together. Lena's hands shook, but her mind was clear. Clearer than it had been in months. Cold and sharp and certain. She kept searching. Found beneath the letter a document that claimed to be the water rights contract Hale was using to demand $5,000 from Caleb. She held it up next to the genuine ranch deeds in the same crate and saw what she needed to see. Different paper, different ink. Signatures that did not match the authentic documents surrounding them. The contract was forged. Everything was connected. Hale had found Lena for Evan, used his territorial connections to track her down. In exchange, Evan was providing Hale with the resources and legal leverage to press his fraudulent water claim. The sabotaged customers, the ring on her windowsill, the $5,000 demand. All part of the same scheme coordinated between a man who wanted her land and a man who wanted her. Lena folded the letter and the forged contract into her apron pocket with hands that trembled with rage rather than fear. She climbed the stairs, crossed the dark kitchen, walked through the sleeping house, and knocked on Caleb's bedroom door. Not to sleep, not to cry, to fight. Caleb read the letter twice. The first time his face went white. The second time it went red. When he looked up, Lena saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Not anger, not grief, but the cold certainty of a man who had just found the thread that might unravel the worst night of his life. "Hale," he said, and the name was a blade. The bridge. He wanted to ride to Hale's ranch immediately. Dutch, roused from the barn where he had been sleeping guard, stopped him with a hand on his arm and a voice that carried 30 years of military discipline. "Hot heads do not win fights. We need a lawyer. We need." Lena agreed. "Evan works through charm. Hale works through the law. We beat them with their own weapons." They composed a letter to a lawyer in Helena that night, dispatching it with one of the younger hands at first light. But the deadline was still counting down and the money was still short, and somewhere out there Evan Rohr was still watching and waiting. Caleb sat at the kitchen table after the others had gone back to bed, staring at the letter from Hale to Evan with an expression that scared Lena more than anything Evan had ever done. Because Evan's cruelty was familiar. She understood it, had survived it, knew its dimensions and its limits. But what she saw in Caleb's face was something else entirely. The look of a man who had spent 3 years believing his wife's death was a tragedy of weather and bad luck, and was now confronting the possibility that it was something far worse. "I need to do something," he said the next morning, buckling his gun belt. His jaw was set in the way Lena had learned meant immovable. "Alone. Where are you going?" He did not answer. Just kissed Mara on the top of her head, squeezed Lena's hand once, and rode out before full light. Lena spent that day in a state of controlled terror that she channeled into bread production, because that was what she knew how to do: knead and shape and bake. Turn fear into flour and flour into something that sustained people. Margaret and Ruth and Sarah worked alongside her without asking questions because they could read the tension in her shoulders and knew better than to pry. Mara stayed close all day, sitting at her small table with her dough and her drawings, looking up frequently to check that Lena was still there. The child could feel the disturbance in the house like an animal sensing a storm, not understanding it, but knowing it was real. Caleb returned at dusk. His knuckles were scraped raw, not from fighting, but from gripping reins too hard for too many miles. His face was ashen, but his eyes held a terrible calm. Lena met him at the door. "What happened? What did he say?" Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he took the forged water rights contract from where Lena had left it on the kitchen shelf, walked to the stove, opened the iron door, and fed the document to the flames. He watched it burn, the paper curling and blackening and dissolving into ash. "I needed to know," he said. "Now I know." He said nothing more about what had passed between him and Grant Hale. Whatever truth he had found on that ride, he locked it away in the same place he kept his grief for Martha, deep and private and not for sharing. But something in him had shifted. A question answered, even if the answer brought no comfort. That night, day 28, Lena was alone in the kitchen working dough at 10 o'clock when she heard hoofbeats coming fast from the east road. Her hands stopped. Her heart, which had been beating steady and sure all day, suddenly hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. Late for visitors. Too late for deliveries. Probably one of the hands returning from town. Probably nothing. She grabbed the kitchen knife anyway. The memory came like a flash of lightning. Ohio. The night she ran. The crack of a pistol and the window frame splintering 3 inches from her head. Glass and splinters spraying against her cheek. The smell of gunpowder. And Evan's voice behind her as she threw herself through the broken window into the dark. You will never get far enough. She moved to the window and looked out. The rider who dismounted in the yard was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the athletic grace of someone who had grown up with privilege and horses, and the certainty that the world would arrange itself around his desires. He wore a fine coat despite the cold, and when he removed his hat to approach the main door, lamplight caught hair the color of wheat, and a face that had once seemed handsome but now looked like nothing but teeth. Evan Rohr had found her. The knife slipped from Lena's numb fingers and clattered on the floor. For one terrible instant, she was back in Ohio, back in the small house with the doors that locked from the outside, back in the body of a woman who believed she deserved what she got, because the man hurting her had told her so every day until she could not remember what her own judgment sounded like. Then she heard Caleb's door open, heard his boots on the floorboards, heard him opening the front door and greeting the late visitor with the wary courtesy of a man who received strangers at unreasonable hours cautiously and with his hand near his hip. Their voices carried through the house. I'm looking for Lena Jameson. I am told she works here. It is urgent family business. Jameson, her real name, the identity she had tried to bury under heart and hard work in 3 states of distance. No one by that name here. She is using an alias. My fiancé, you understand. She is disturbed, not right in the head. Her family is worried sick, and I have come to take her home where she can get proper care. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, delivered with such apparent concern that someone who did not know better might actually believe it. Might think he was a loving man, worried about a troubled woman. Might think she needed saving from herself rather than from him. Lena found herself moving before conscious thought caught up, walking through the house toward the voices, toward the confrontation she had spent 8 months running from. Her hands were empty now, the knife forgotten on the kitchen floor. But she did not need weapons. She needed only the truth and the courage to speak it. She opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch into the lamplight. Directly between Caleb and Evan Rohr, Evan's eyes widened when he saw her, his smooth expression cracking. She had changed. The full-figured woman he had controlled and diminished was still full-figured, but differently now, stronger, harder. Her eyes held something they had never held before. Not fear, fury. Lena, my dear, you have lost so much weight. Are they feeding you properly here? The concern was flawless. The loving fiancé worried about his beloved. But Lena saw what Caleb could not see, what only she could recognize after 2 years of Evan's particular brand of destruction. The rage beneath the concern, the fury that she had dared to leave, the cold calculation of a man who had come to reclaim property that had escaped. I am not going with you, she said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. I left. I am not coming back. We were not engaged, not really, not in any way that mattered. You are confused, Lena. You are not well. My uncle sold me to you to clear his gambling debts. Lena said it flat and plain and true. He gave you control of my inheritance in exchange for paying off what he owed. That is not family. That is a transaction. Evan's mask slipped. His face hardened. Careful, Lena. You are saying things that could be misinterpreted. I am saying things that are true. You kept me locked in your house for 6 months. You controlled every dollar I spent, every person I spoke to. When I tried to leave, you hit me hard enough to crack my ribs. She felt Caleb go rigid beside her, but she did not look at him, kept her eyes fixed on Evan. "And I know about Grant Hale," she said, dropping her voice low enough that only Evan could hear. "I have the letter, the one connecting you two. I know the water contract is forged, and I know about the bridge." Evan's face went genuinely pale. For the first time in all the years Lena had known him, she saw real fear. Not of Caleb's fists, of consequences, of a territorial prison cell and the hangman's attention for whatever had happened to that bridge on the night Martha Wright died. "You think you can just leave?" Evan whispered, his composure crumbling. "Steal what is mine and disappear?" "I was never yours to steal from," Lena said, "and I am worth more than you ever let me believe." Evan moved fast. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, his grip immediately brutal, fingers digging into bone. Lena cried out more from shock than pain. Caleb moved faster. He broke Evan's grip with one sharp motion and shoved him backward hard enough to send him stumbling off the porch and into the dirt. "Touch her again," Caleb said, and his voice was the deadliest thing Lena had ever heard. Quiet, level, absolutely certain. "And I will break every bone in your hand." She said no. "That is the end of this conversation." Evan scrambled up mud on his fine coat, rage contorting his face into the truth of what he was. No charm left, no mask. Just a man who had lost control of something he believed he owned and could not process the reality of it. "I see," he spat. "She has replaced me. Found herself a rancher to keep her fed. How long did it take you to—" "That is my mama." The voice cut through the night like a bell struck in a cathedral, high and clear and utterly unexpected. Everyone froze. Lena turned and saw Mara standing in the doorway in her nightgown, her small face set with fierce protectiveness, the expression of a creature defending what belonged to her with everything she had. 4 months of silence. 4 months of gestures and drawings and gifts left on stairs. 4 months of fighting to break through a wall that trauma had built around her voice. And now, words. The first words Mara had trusted anyone enough to speak since the night her mother died, and she had used them to claim Lena as hers. Caleb's breath caught so hard it sounded like breaking. Mara crossed the porch on bare feet, wrapped her arms around Lena's waist, and looked up at Evan Rohr with eyes that saw everything adults tried to hide. Eyes that had already witnessed the worst the world could do and had decided to keep living anyway. "He is bad," Mara said. Her voice was rusty and small, like a door opening for the first time in a long time. "Make him go away." Out of the mouth of a child came truth so simple and devastating that adults could only stand witness. Evan stared at Mara with naked contempt, all pretense of concern abandoned. "Keep your brat under control," he snarled. That was his mistake. Caleb closed the distance between them in 2 strides and hit Evan square in the jaw, a solid right cross that put every ounce of grief and rage and 3 years of helpless guilt behind it. Evan went down hard, sprawling in the dirt and the manure, blood streaming from his split lip, his expensive coat ruined. "Leave," Caleb said, standing over him. "Tonight, and do not come back. If you set foot on my land again, if you come anywhere near Lena or my daughter, I will kill you. That is not a threat. It is a promise." Evan climbed to his feet, swaying. He looked at Lena one last time, and whatever he saw in her face must have told him the truth he had been denying. She was lost to him, had maybe never been his to begin with, and all his power and control and cruelty had failed to make her small enough to keep. "This is not over," he said through the blood on his lips. "Yes," Lena replied, her voice steady and sure. "It is." He mounted his horse with difficulty, one hand pressed to his bleeding mouth. He rode into the darkness without looking back. Mara tugged on Lena's dress. "Is he really gone? Really gone and never coming back?" Lena knelt and gathered the child into her arms. "Yes, sweetheart. He is really gone. I promise." "Good." Mara's small hand patted Lena's cheek. "I do not like mean people. Neither do I, baby. Neither do I." Caleb gathered them both up and shepherded them inside where it was warm and safe and theirs. He locked the door with deliberate care, the bolt clicking into place with a sound that meant not imprisonment but protection. Through the wall, the clock struck midnight. Day 29. 24 hours left. $4,873. They were $127 short. And the lawyer from Helena still had not arrived. Lena sat at the kitchen table in the gray light before dawn, staring at the numbers in her ledger that refused to change no matter how many times she counted them. Around her, the household was already awake, drawn from beds by the gravity of the day. The final day. Mara sat in Caleb's lap at the head of the table, chattering. The child, who had not spoken for 4 months, was making up for lost time with a vengeance, words tumbling out faster than anyone could follow. Why is dough sticky? Why do birds fly but chickens do not? Why was that mean man here last night? Is Mama going to make bread today? Can I help? Why is Papa's hand all red and puffy? Caleb answered each question with the patient thoroughness of a man who understood that every word his daughter spoke was a miracle and should be treated accordingly, even the ones about his swollen knuckles. Margaret and Ruth arrived before the sun cleared the mountains. Sarah came with Anna close behind, both women carrying the grim determination of people who had fought hard lives and were not about to surrender to this one. $127, Margaret said, reading Lena's ledger with the directness that defined everything she did. We need $127 by sundown. Ruth reached into her coat and produced a silver hair comb, old and ornate with delicate filigree work that spoke of better times and careful keeping. An heirloom. Something precious carried through years of widowhood and hardship. This is worth $30 at a fair price. Take it, Ruth. I cannot. You can, and you will. Ruth's voice brooked no argument. I have survived alone for 15 years. This is the first time in my life I have had somewhere I belong. Do not take that away from me by being too proud to accept help. Lena took the comb. Her eyes burned. Margaret produced a small envelope of savings she had been keeping for winter supplies. Sarah's husband sent his poker winnings, apologizing through Sarah that it was not more. 2 of the younger ranch hands contributed a day's wages each. Dutch was last. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch stained dark with age and placed it on the table with the careful reverence of a man handling something holy. Been carrying this since Shiloh, he said. His voice was rough. Gold coins. 33 years I have kept them because I was not sure what they were for. Now I know. He opened the pouch and poured the coins onto the table. They caught the lamplight and gleamed like small suns. They counted everything twice. $4,969, 31 short. The sun went down on day 29, and they were $31 from saving the ranch and not a penny more to be found. Lena sat alone at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed or to their posts. The lamp burned low. The numbers stared back at her from the page, immovable. $31. After everything, all the work and the sacrifice and the fighting, $31 stood between them and destruction. She did not sleep that night. Sat in the kitchen and watched the dark sky outside the window lighten by degrees, gray to pale to pink to gold, and listened to the world wake up around her. Horses moving in the barn, a rooster crowing, the creak of the house settling, then hoofbeats on the road. Her body went rigid, every nerve firing, every muscle tensing. The memory of every other time hoofbeats had meant danger flooding through her like ice water. But the rider who appeared through the morning mist was not Evan Rohr. It was a woman, tall and straight-backed, riding a good horse with the easy competence of someone who had spent her life getting where she needed to go. Iron gray hair pinned up under a sensible hat, wire-rimmed spectacles, a leather satchel strapped to her saddle. She dismounted in the yard and approached the house with the measured stride of someone accustomed to being the most capable person in any room she entered. Constance Hartwell, attorney at law from Helena. She said it like she was reading from a business card. I am looking for Mrs. Lena Wright, formerly Lena Jameson of Ohio. Lena's blood went cold. I am Lena Hart. I am not. Your legal name remains Jameson until you file otherwise. Hartwell's expression was professional and contained but not unkind. I have been retained to locate you regarding your uncle's estate. Harold Jameson died 3 weeks ago. Liver failure. You are named as his sole heir. The room shifted. Caleb appeared behind Lena, his hand on her shoulder. Mara pressed against her leg. Dutch stood by the stove with his rifle, out of habit rather than necessity. Hartwell spread papers on the kitchen table with methodical precision and explained in clear, careful language what had happened. Harold Jameson's death had triggered an audit of the trust he had managed. Lena's parents had left a considerable inheritance held in trust until her 25th birthday. Harold had been the trustee but could not access the principal. He had, however, been embezzling the interest payments for years and had used the trust as collateral for debts he could not repay. The trust lawyers recovered what they could, settled Harold's debts. The remainder passed to Lena as the sole surviving beneficiary. The total amount, Hartwell said, laying the final document on the table, after legal fees and estate settlement comes to $22,416. The silence that followed was so complete Lena could hear her own heartbeat. She stared at the number. Her mind refused to process it. $22,000, more money than she had ever imagined having. Inherited from parents she barely remembered, stolen by an uncle she had trusted, and now returned to her like some cosmic joke about timing and justice and the strange way the universe occasionally decides to balance its books. Hartwell continued, her tone businesslike but not without sympathy. There is more. My office has independently verified that the water rights contract Mr. Hale presented to this ranch does not exist in any territorial records. It is a fabrication, combined with a letter Mrs. Wright discovered connecting Mr. Hale to a Mr. Evan Rohr of Ohio. We have grounds for both dismissal of the claim and a countersuit for fraud. And, Hartwell paused meaningfully, my investigation has revealed that Mr. Rohr's urgency in locating you was triggered by the trust audit. He learned the inheritance would be discovered and wanted to reclaim you before you learned you were a woman of independent means. The pieces fell into place with the terrible clarity of a puzzle that had been waiting for its final piece. Evan had not tracked her across 3 states because he loved her. He had tracked her because he knew she was about to become rich, and a rich Lena who knew her own worth was a Lena who would never come back to him. His entire campaign of terror had been a race against time. Against the truth. We can pay Hale, Lena said. You can pay Hale, Caleb corrected gently. That is your money, Lena. She looked at him, this man who had offered her $12 a month and a locked door and had ended up giving her the world. This ranch is my home, she said. You and Mara are my family, and I am investing in my future, not making a donation. They paid Grant Hale that afternoon. Constance Hartwell presented a bank draft for exactly $5,000 in the presence of the territorial judge she had brought from Helena for exactly this purpose. Hale arrived expecting a broken man begging for more time. Instead, he found a lawyer, a judge, a stack of evidence, and Caleb Wright standing behind his wife with his arms crossed and his eyes hard as Montana granite. Your contract is forged, Hartwell said with surgical precision. We have proof. We also have correspondence connecting you to Evan Rohr, and some very uncomfortable questions about a bridge that collapsed under suspicious circumstances 3 years ago. You may accept this payment and consider the matter closed, or we can proceed through the territorial court, where all of this evidence will become public record. Hale's hands shook as he took the draft. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He mounted his horse and rode away, and every person standing in that yard knew they would never see him on right land again. That night, after the celebration had quieted and Mara was asleep upstairs and the house had settled into its nighttime peace, Caleb found Lena in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table where she had sat on her first night, hands folded, looking at nothing in particular. He sat across from her. took her hands. "Marry me," he said. "Not because of the money or the ranch or because it makes practical sense, though Margaret will tell you it does. Marry me because I love you and Mara loves you, and I want to spend the rest of my life watching you turn flower into miracles and make this place feel like a home instead of just a house where people sleep." Lena looked at him. This man who gave compliments like they cost him blood and meant every word twice over, who had punched her abuser in the face without hesitation, whose daughter had broken 4 months of silence to claim Lena as her mother. "Ask me tomorrow," she said. "After I have slept, after I can believe I deserve this. I will ask every day until you believe it." "Then yes," she whispered. "Tomorrow, the answer will be yes." She slept 16 hours, woke on day 31 to find Caleb sitting beside her bed with Mara in his lap, both of them watching her with the same patient, hopeful eyes. She did not wait for him to ask. "Yes," she said it before her courage could fail her. "Yes, to you and Mara and this life. Yes, to staying and building and trusting that good things can last. Just yes." Caleb's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Brilliant and inevitable and warm enough to melt every frozen thing she had carried for 26 years. Mara squealed and launched herself onto the bed, wrapping around Lena like she intended never to let go. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lena believed in something she had thought was only for other people. A future. They married on a Saturday morning in December when the world was white with fresh snow and the sky was so blue it hurt to look at directly. The ceremony took place in the ranch house parlor with the territorial judge officiating, Dutch and Margaret standing as witnesses, and Mara between the bride and groom, in a dress Sarah had sewn from fabric ordered special from the mercantile. Lena wore a simple cream-colored dress that Ruth had altered to fit her changed body. No corset crushing her ribs, no layers designed to hide what she had been taught to be ashamed of. Just cloth that acknowledged her shape and moved on to more important considerations. When the judge asked if she took Caleb Wright to be her lawfully wedded husband, Lena said "I do" with a steadiness that surprised her. It was the first major decision of her entire life that she had made without fear, without calculation, without wondering what the cost would be. Caleb kissed her gently and thoroughly, and with the particular attention of a man who understood that some moments deserved to be lived slowly. When they broke apart, Mara was already wrapping around both their legs, demanding inclusion. The judge smiled. Dutch wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and denied it when Margaret noticed. "To the right family," Dutch said, raising his glass. "May your bread always rise, your cattle stay healthy, and your love prove as stubborn as the both of you." "Can we have cake now?" Mara demanded, and the room dissolved into laughter. The celebration was modest by normal standards, but felt extravagant to Lena. Bread and pies from the bakery that had saved them, whiskey passed in generous measure. Dutch playing fiddle badly, but with tremendous enthusiasm while the ranch hands clapped along and Mara danced in circles until she fell down dizzy and demanded to do it again. The trial came in March. Evan Rohr's lawsuit, breach of contract, he claimed, demanding $15,000, targeting Lena's inheritance with the predatory precision of a man who had run out of other weapons. Constance Hartwell dismantled his case with the quiet efficiency of someone performing routine surgery. But the moment Lena would carry with her forever came during cross-examination, when Evan's lawyer Morrison asked with heavy skepticism why she had married so quickly after arriving in Montana, if not to secure a financial future. "I married a rancher who was facing foreclosure," Lena said from the witness stand, her voice steady and clear. "I worked myself half to death to save his ranch. When my inheritance came through, I used it to pay his debts instead of keeping it for myself. If I was chasing money, sir, I made spectacularly poor choices." Quiet laughter rippled through the courtroom. Morrison's jaw tightened. Judge Sarah Blackwood dismissed the case with prejudice, ordered Evan to pay court costs and legal fees for the defense, issued a warning that crackled with judicial authority. "Mr. Rohr, this lawsuit is nothing more than a final attempt to exert power over a woman who had the strength to reclaim her life. I suggest you reclaim your own, somewhere far from Montana territory. If you contact Mrs. Wright again in any capacity, I will consider it harassment and issue an order of protection. Am I clear? Yes, Your Honor. Evan's voice was barely audible. Then we are done here. The gavel fell, and with it fell the last chain Evan Rohr had tried to wrap around Lena's life. He left the courthouse without looking back. She would never see him again. Some monsters did not get dramatic final confrontations. They got legal footnotes and empty roads and the slow irrelevance of men whose power depended on other people's fear. After the trial, Dutch asked Caleb to walk with him, just the two of them, up the hill behind the ranch house to the place where Martha was buried. A simple stone marker under a cottonwood tree, looking out over the valley she had helped build. They stood there for a long time without speaking. Two men who had known each other for decades and had run out of small talk years ago. Then Dutch said what he had been carrying for 3 years. I was there that night, the night she died. Got word from a rider that the bridge was out and rode like hell to get here by the back trail. Made it to the house 20 minutes too late. She was already gone by the time I came through the door. Caleb stood very still. But she was not alone, Caleb. Dutch's voice cracked. Not at the very end. I held her hand. She knew someone was there. She said your name. Said to tell you she loved you and to take care of the girl. Then she went quiet. Dutch wiped his eyes with a weathered hand and did not bother to pretend it was wind. I should have told you years ago. I was afraid you would blame me for not getting there sooner, for being too late. I have carried that every day since, and I am tired of it. She was not alone. That is what matters. She was not alone. Caleb wept. Standing at his first wife's grave on a spring afternoon with the man who had been more father to him than his own blood, he wept for the first time since Martha died. Not from grief, but from relief. The worst thing he had believed, the image that had haunted his nightmares for 3 years, was not true. Martha had not died screaming into emptiness. Someone had been there. Someone had held her hand. Thank you, Caleb said when he could speak, for being there, for telling me now. She made me promise to look after you and the girl. Dutch settled his hat back on his head. Reckon I have done a fair job of it. They walked back to the ranch together without speaking further. Sometimes silence between men said more than words, and what passed between them on that walk needed no translation. Hartwell filed the countersuit against Hale. The territorial court ordered him to pay restitution and stripped his fraudulent water rights claim. The question of the bridge remained officially unanswered. No confession, no arrest, no tidy resolution. But Hale's reputation in the territory was destroyed. He sold his land within the year and moved to California. Not the territorial prison, but exile. And for a man who had measured his worth in land and power and the ability to bend his neighbors to his will, exile was its own kind of sentence. Ruth Whitfield became a full partner in the bakery operation. The woman who had arrived with a rolling pin and a critique of Lena's dough hydration found, at 58, the family she had never had. Lena returned her silver comb and bought her a proper set of baking tools, each one engraved with her name. First time anyone has put my name on something that matters, Ruth said, and she did not cry because Ruth Whitfield did not cry, but her voice cracked just enough. Margaret and Sarah became co-owners of the expanding Wright Ranch Bakery. Margaret's final assessment of Lena, delivered with the bluntness that was her gift and her weapon, was this: smart woman knows when to listen. You finally learned, girl. Took you long enough. The bakery grew through spring and into summer. They opened a small storefront in Helena, hired a manager to run it, began shipping bread and pies to mining camps as far as the Idaho border. The steady income meant the ranch could breathe without counting every dollar, meant they could plan for the future with the confidence of people who knew their ground was solid. Mara talked constantly now, helped in the bakery with deadly seriousness. Informed everyone who would listen that she was going to teach her future sibling all the important things, like where the best rocks are, and how to catch frogs, and that Mama makes the best bread in the whole world, and Papa gives the best hugs, Everything important, Caleb agreed gravely. The baby came on a September morning when the air smelled of harvest and changing seasons. Thomas, named for Lena's father. The one good memory from before everything went wrong. No storm that day. Clear skies and gentle wind, and Caleb there from beginning to end, holding Lena's hand, letting her crush his fingers, telling her she was strong enough even when she was certain she was not. When the baby emerged squalling and red-faced and furious at being forced into the cold world, Lena looked down at her son and felt something crack open in her chest that was bigger than any word she knew. Caleb stood beside her with tears streaming down his face and one hand on the baby's head and the other gripping Lena's shoulder like he was afraid that if he let go, the whole impossible, beautiful reality of his life would dissolve like morning mist. "He is perfect," Caleb whispered. "He is ours," Lena corrected. "Completely and totally ours." A year to the day since she had arrived at the Wright Ranch, Lena stood on the same porch where she had once knocked with a carpet bag, and bruises she could not explain away. Thomas was warm against her chest, his small fist gripping her collar with the lazy confidence of a baby who had never known anything but safety. Mara hung from Caleb's hand, chattering about frogs and rocks and whether the barn cat had had kittens yet. The kitchen behind them smelled of bread rising and coffee brewing and the indefinable scent of home. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked. "Distance," she said, "not the miles from Ohio. The distance between who I was and who I have become." He kissed her temple. "You did not change. You just finally let yourself be who you always were." That evening, cleaning out the last of her old things to make room in the bedroom closet, Lena found the carpet bag. She had not opened it in months. At the bottom, beneath everything else, was the handkerchief. She unwrapped it and held the bullet up to the fading light. That small piece of lead that had missed her head by 3 inches on the worst night of her life. The price of freedom, the weight of fear. She carried it to the porch. The Montana evening stretched out before her, mountains gold with sunset, the ranch spread below, the distant sound of cattle and the nearer sound of Mara singing one of Dutch's fiddle tunes off-key and at full volume. Lena drew her arm back and threw the bullet as far as she could into the tall grass. She did not watch where it landed, did not need to. Some things you carry until you do not, and then you put them down and walk toward whatever comes next with both hands free. She went inside, locked the door. Not from fear, but from the quiet habit of a woman who understood the value of safety, because she had earned it the hardest way possible. "Mama?" Mara's voice drifted down from the top of the stairs. "Will you sing me the song? The one from the barn?" Lena climbed the stairs, sat on the edge of Mara's bed, and sang her grandmother's song, the one about the garden and the valley, and finding your way home. In the barn during the storm, she could not remember the words. Tonight she remembered everyone. Mara's eyes closed. Her breathing slowed. Her small hand held Lena's, loosely now, the grip of a child who no longer feared that the people she loved would disappear. Downstairs, Caleb rocked Thomas by the fire. The bread dough rose slowly on the counter, patient as always, waiting for morning and heat and the hands that would shape it into something worth sharing. And Lena, who had crossed 3 states and 1 impossible year to get here, finally stopped measuring the distance to the nearest exit, because she was not passing through anymore. She was home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.